Here's what's coming up on the world today. Sudan's army accuses its rival paramilitary rapid support forces of opening fire on a Turkish evacuation plane as it landed at an airport outside of Khartoum. The White House urges Americans to leave Sudan within the next 24 to 48 hours. Welcome back to the program. We'll begin with an update from the Sudan crisis. Heavy explosions and gunfire have rocked parts of Sudan's capital and its twin city, Omdurman, despite the extension of a fragile truce between the country's top two generals, whose power struggle has killed hundreds. Sudan's army has accused its rival paramilitary rapid support forces of opening fire on a Turkish evacuation plane as it landed at Wadi Seydna Airport outside Khartoum. Turkey's foreign ministry confirmed the aircraft sustained small arms fire but said no injuries were reported and the C-130 plane required repairs. However, the Rapid Support Forces has denied firing on the evacuation plane, accusing the army of spreading lies. It comes as the two factions agreed to prolong a ceasefire by 72 hours to allow for humanitarian access, but fighting flared. Earlier, Sudan's army and a paramilitary force battled in Khartoum yesterday, testing U.S. and African efforts to pause a conflict that has turned residential areas into war zones and sent tens of thousands of people fleeing for their lives. During a visit to Washington, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres thanked the U.S. for its efforts to help evacuate UN and other personnel from Sudan. Many foreign nationals remain stuck in Sudan despite an exodus marking one of the largest such evacuations since the withdrawal of U.S.-led forces from Afghanistan in 2021.
We're working very closely together to deal with the crisis in Sudan, hopefully working toward a more enduring ceasefire, cessation of hostilities, and helping to put Sudan back on the track that it was on to civilian-led government, while dealing with, I think, an increasingly challenging humanitarian situation there.
And I want to express my gratitude for the support that U.S. security officers have given to the important operation of relocation that we did, a convoy of 1,200, both staff members of the UN, but also of NGOs and of different missions, from Khartoum to Port Sudan in the middle of a very difficult situation. And indeed, the cooperation with the US and with the US security office was absolutely precious for us. So thank you very much for that support.
Meanwhile, White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre says the situation in Sudan could worsen at any moment, and Americans should leave within the next 24 to 48 hours. Since fighting erupted on April the 15th, airstrikes and artillery have killed at least 512 people, wounded nearly 4,200, destroyed hospitals and limited food distribution in the vast nation, where a third of 46 million people were already reliant on humanitarian aid.
So following intense negotiation, the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and Rapid Support Forces, RSF, agreed to implement, as you all know, a 72-hour nationwide ceasefire starting at midnight on April 24th, which was about 2 days ago. While there was an initial reduction in reports of violence, we are deeply concerned by the increase in ceasefire violations yesterday. We urge the SAF and the RSF to fully uphold and extend the ceasefire. We're working continuously to create options for American citizens to leave Sudan promptly because the situation could deteriorate at any moment, and we are communicating with citizens who have requested information about those options. We have deployed U.S. intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets to support air and land evacuation routes, which Americans are using, and we are moving naval assets within the region to be pre-positioned to provide any necessary support along along the coast. U.S. Africa Command has established a deconfliction cell to facilitate coordination with our allies and partners in this effort, and any option entails a degree of risk. But because the situation is unlikely to improve, we encourage Americans who want to leave to take advantage of the options that are available to them in the next 24 to 48 hours.
Let's take a look at how this whole situation has impacted people in Sudan. Deski Bedin knew her family would have to flee their home in Sudan when armed men knocked at their door. She reached a refugee camp in Chad on Wednesday, one of thousands seeking safety across the border as fighting engulfs their homeland. According to the UN Refugee Agency, the majority of Sudanese escaping their country have fled to Chad. Around 20,000 refugees have so far made the journey, and continued fighting is expected to trigger more displacement.
On Wednesday, large crowds of women and children milled around Kafrun camp near Sudanese border, where others rested in makeshift shelters of sticks and rushes tacked with pieces of cloth for privacy. Sudan erupted into warfare on April 15, derailing a transition of civilian rule. Since then, clashes between the army and paramilitaries have turned residential areas into battlefields. UNHCR expects a further 100,000 refugees to flee to Chad from Sudan in a worst-case scenario, according to its Chad representative, Laura Lucastro, who was at the border last week. A wave of arrivals places an additional burden on Chad's meager resources, which were already strained by hosting 400,000 refugees who fled earlier conflicts in Sudan. Suraya Arun and a toddler arrived in the camp early on Wednesday after fleeing Tibelti, the Sudanese village 35 kilometers away. As evening approached, she was still looking for somewhere to rest overnight. Now she faces a new challenge, finding potable water to drink.
The Sudanese Foreign Ministry has filed a complaint with the World Health Organization regarding what it calls the occupation of hospitals by the paramilitary rapid support forces. The ministry said RSF had occupied 12 hospitals in the capital Khartoum, a gross violation of international humanitarian law, rules of engagement and international human rights law that protect the sanctity of these facilities. Several hospitals have been reportedly destroyed by the bombings. Meanwhile, the army is accusing RSF fighters of using residential areas and healthcare facilities as hiding places and using civilians as human shields. The RSF has not responded to these allegations. And as the fighting in Sudan completes a second week, citizens fear that diminishing food supplies could lead into a famine. Khartoum resident Tariq Ahmed managed to purchase bread, eggs, and a watermelon, among other things, that he went grocery shopping for on Thursday, but fears a food crisis lies ahead. Several shops were seen closed, and the open bakeries soon ran out of bread. And here in Nigeria, the federal government has announced that the first set of Nigerians from Sudan are expected to arrive in the country today. Chairman of the Nigerians in Diaspora Commission, Mrs. Abike Dabiri-Rewa, made this known while briefing State House correspondents during the 70th session of the weekly ministerial briefing. She notes that 13 buses departed from 2 universities in Khartoum carrying Nigerian students to the Aswan border in Egypt, where they were to be airlifted to Nigeria. She allayed the fears of being attacked by the warlords, saying that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Jeffrey Onyema, already secured the understanding of the 2 warlords before the transportation of Nigerians by road. Away from the Sudan crisis, at least 11 people have died and 1 other missing when a ferry capsized off the eastern coast of Indonesia's Sumatra Island. A video from the Indonesian National Search and Rescue Agency shows locals trending to survivors on the ground at Indragiri Hilir after they were rescued out of sea. Officials say the ferry was carrying about 74 people to the small island of Tanjung Pinang near neighboring Singapore when it's suspected to have hit a log about 30 minutes after it set sail. The rescue agency said a search is underway for one person still missing, adding that reports were still coming from witnesses. Elsewhere, the European Union has recently approved a new measure to meet its climate goals. The 27-member EU bloc has refined some of its existing policies and added new ones to inch closer to its climate agenda. Some of these measures may imply a change in business and trade deals with the EU in the coming years. For more on this, we're joined by the DW's Warder Imran. Warder, good to see you today. So what are some of these new measures that the EU members approved recently?
So, three major pieces of legislation have been approved. The first concerns emissions. So there's reforms to Europe's current emissions trading scheme, which regulates the EU's carbon market, where carbon permits are traded. This helps keep emissions of different sectors in check. The plan is to now add shipping sector into the scheme too. The industries that were receiving free permits earlier will no longer have these permits in the coming years. The plan is to have all sectors be on a level playing for real emissions reduction. The EU also approved a social climate fund, which will help smaller businesses, vulnerable households, and others navigate through this big energy transition. Because they want to add more sectors into the emissions trading scheme, they need to also be prepared for higher prices for transport or housing, for example. And of great significance is the carbon border adjustment. It's called an adjustment, but it's basically a sort of tax that will be levied on imports for industries that emit carbon heavily. This measure, the EU says, is to prevent companies inside or outside the EU from relocating to a different region with less strict laws. This is to be introduced in 2026.
So what do these measures mean for Germany's current and potential trading partners?
Right. So the carbon border tax that I just mentioned is a big step. These measures have been on the table and being negotiated for at least 2 years. The approval of this means big changes are in the pipeline. The EU bloc says this tax is meant to encourage partners to look into decarbonization policies. So products coming in that exceed the carbon norms will have to have an emission certificate, the price of which is not yet determined. This could act as an opportunity or as an additional cost for Germany's trading partners. And while many countries in the EU are aligned with the Commission on climate change, they're still mulling over additional measures. The introduction of this carbon border adjustment will only come, as I mentioned, in 2026. Whether this will have an effect on pricing of products or on trading activity, we're yet to see.
So the European Commission's president, said Europe will be the first climate neutral continent. Is the bloc doing as much as it should?
Yes, the EU Commission's president, Ursula von der Leyen, did say that she wants Europe to be the first climate-neutral continent. And as you can see, the EU has very ambitious climate goals. And while most of the bloc's members subscribe to the same climate goals, some do even more, like Netherlands, which has recently introduced a 28 billion euro package for pushing green solutions. Yet, there is still much disagreement over some areas. Some member states, like Poland, for example, have voiced concerns that the EU's climate policies set unrealistic goals. So I think a lot of this legislation becomes a bit tough for all member states to implement. But, for example, take the climate measures we're talking about. 2 members voted against it, and some even abstained. What this implies is that, yes, in theory, Europe is advancing its fight against climate change, and it is trying to push businesses and trading partners to take a more active role in reducing emissions. But much policy work and then large-scale implementation of these policies will have to be put in for the right impact. Many environmental groups constantly criticize Germany and the Union for not doing enough or not doing fast enough. So we'll have to see if these measures will have a significant impact on the bloc's emissions.
Warder, thank you so much for an update on that situation. Welcome back. We head to the U.S., where former U.S. Vice President Mike Pence has testified as part of a criminal investigation into alleged efforts by former U.S. President Donald Trump to overturn his defeat in the 2020 election. 63-year-old Pence sat for more than 7 hours before a federal grand jury in Washington, D.C. He was issued with a subpoena to testify under oath earlier this year. The questioning by prosecutors took place behind closed doors. His appearance comes just hours after an appeals court rejected a last-ditch bid by Mr. Trump's legal team to stop Mr. Pence from testifying. Mr. Pence's lawyers had also sought unsuccessfully to challenge the subpoena, arguing that his role as president of the Senate during his time in office meant he had congressional immunity. His eventual testimony, which had been sought for months, is a major milestone in the 2-year investigation, which is being led by Special Counsel Jack Smith, a former war crimes prosecutor who was appointed to the role by Attorney General Merrick Garland. The investigation has been gathering evidence about whether former U.S. President Donald Trump and his allies broke federal law in their efforts to challenge the results of the 2020 election, which was won by President Joe Biden. Meanwhile, Mr. Trump used his first campaign event since President Joe Biden officially entered the 2024 election race to speak out against his rival. Speaking to more than 1,000 supporters, Mr. Trump sought to reframe the choice between the two candidates. Mr. Biden, a Democrat, launched his re-election campaign 2 days ago with a video promising to protect personal freedoms from extremists linked to the former Republican president. However, Mr. Trump drew applause from his supporters when he mocked Mr. Biden's re-election statement.
Biden announced his presidential campaign by, get this, a prepackaged video. I was going to do that for you today. I'll do a little video, send it up to New Hampshire. You wouldn't have been very happy about that. But when you're running for president, you think at least one time you'd get up and say, I'm running for president. Where am I going? Where the hell am I going? I want to get out. Oh, no, over there, over there. It's almost inconceivable that Biden would have even thought of running for re-election. He's destroyed our country, and yet he says in his recorded piece that he wants to finish the job. That's right, he wants to finish the job of destroying our country. But on that, he's actually very close. He is very close to finishing the job, unfortunately. I will be retiring the name Crooked from Hillary Clinton and her moniker. And I'm going to give her a new name, I don't know, like maybe Lovely Hillary or Beautiful Hillary. But I'm going to retire the name Crooked so that we can use the name for Joe Biden, because he'll be known from now on as Crooked Joe Biden. You know, I said in a speech recently, somebody said, what do you think about Xi? I said, he's a very powerful, strong man. He's at the top of his game. The fake news media said, how dare they say that? I said, what am I going to say? He controls 1.5 billion people. No, he's not at the top of his game. The same thing with other leaders. They're sharp. They're smart. They're at the top of their game. We're the only one that has one that's not. And he's not close. And he never really had a top of the game if you go back 25 years. And so many different things we did. We did a great job. We never got credit for that one. They give Biden credit. He doesn't know he's alive. I mean, jeez. And very sadly, there's never been talk like what you're hearing now, because this guy doesn't have a clue how to speak. He's too tough when he should be soft. He's too soft when he should be tough. He says things that are so bad, provokes, and then shows weakness. It's the craziest thing. He says just the opposite of what you have to say. If we allow them to cheat again, you're not going to have a country. If you put me back in the White House, the reign of corrupt Washington establishment will be over, and America will be a free nation once again.
Staying in the United States, U.S. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas says the United States will dedicate specially trained asylum officers to new refugee centers in Guatemala and Colombia as Washington seeks to create new lawful pathways for migrants. The announcement was part of a series of actions rolled out by President Joe Biden's administration to address a possible increase in illegal immigration when COVID-19 border restrictions in place since 2020 are expected to end on May the 11th. According to Mayorkas, the centers will be scaled up but are expected to process between 5,000 and 6,000 individuals a month at the start. Elsewhere, India's defense minister has accused China of eroding the entire basis of ties between the two countries by violating bilateral agreements, a reference to a nearly 3-year-old standoff involving thousands of soldiers stationed along their disputed border in the eastern Ladakh region. Indian defense minister met with visiting Chinese defense minister and had frank discussions about the developments in the Indian-China border areas, as well as bilateral relations. According to India's defense ministry, there was no immediate comment on the talks from the Chinese side. India says the deployment of a large number of Chinese troops, their aggressive behavior, and attempts to unilaterally alter the border status agreements between the countries. A clash 3 years ago in the Ladakh region killed 20 Indian soldiers and 4 Chinese. It turned into a long-running standoff in the rugged mountainous area where each side has stationed tens of thousands of military personnel backed by artillery, tanks and fighter jets. And crowds of travelers took to Shanghai's Hongqiao railway station as China braces for a record-high travel rush over the Labor holiday weekend. Authorities are expecting 19 million trips to be made across China's vast railway network on Saturday, the first day of the 5-day holiday, which would be the highest number of rail trips made in a single day in the country's history. It compares to a 4.4 million rail trips on May the 1st last year, when China locked down several cities, including Shanghai, to battle the spread of the virus. The last peak of 18.8 billion on the same day in 2021. And finally on the program, King Charles III will be crowned at London's Westminster Abbey on May the 6th in a ceremony full of pomp and pageantry with traditions dating back 1,000 years. Buckingham Palace has been slowly releasing details of the event, which is set to have a few differences from that of Queen Elizabeth in 1953, most notably in its scale, partly reflecting the modern age and the current cost of living crisis. Our London correspondent, Teniola Oyitayo, reports on what to expect from the big day.
This is Westminster Abbey, the royal church where coronations for British monarchs have been held for the past 1,000 years. On the 6th of May, King Charles will be crowned here over 70 years after his mother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, was also crowned. It will be the 40th coronation ceremony held at the Abbey since 1066.
The coronation, Charles will be formally, as king, will be presented to the people in Westminster Abbey, which is the traditional place where almost all coronations have taken place in London, and there he will formally be crowned. So that is the huge part and the central part of the ceremony.
The formal celebrations will begin with a procession from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey. The 74-year-old and his wife Camilla will travel in the Diamond Jubilee stagecoach, built to commemorate Queen Elizabeth's 60th year on the throne and first used in 2014.
Well, it's the first time that this carriage has been used at a coronation. It was delivered to Queen Elizabeth II in 2014 and used for the state opening of Parliament that year and on a few occasions subsequently. But of course, therefore, it's never had the chance to be used in such a historic and important occasion.
The UK is, according to the royal family website, the only European country that still uses regalia, the symbols of royalty, like the crown, in coronations. While there are likely to be some new touches, King Charles will be crowned in the same chair as monarchs of the past, like King Henry VIII. Pope Francis has gifted fragments believed to be from the true cross on which Jesus was crucified to form part of a new processional cross. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, also recently received the Bible prepared specially for the coronation.
I mean, it's a beautifully bound and everything Bible, all done in gold leaf and wonderful. But its significance is not so much the value of the book, but the words used in the service, the greatest treasure this world affords, about the Bible, meaning the contents of it, are at the heart of this country's values and culture and tradition. And still, Christians believe that in there you find God's guidance and God's rule for a good society.
Invitations have been sent to about 2,000 people. Kings, queens, princes and princesses will be joined by world leaders at the coronation. More than 6,000 members of the armed forces will be taking part, making it the largest military ceremonial operation in 70 years. As the day draws near, final rehearsals have been taking place, like this one, by a children's choir, readying their voices for the big day. From London, Teniola Oyetayo for Channels Television News.
That's our program today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Joke Rogers. Bye for now.